So, Christodoulos, you won the Joseph M. Hassett Bursary in UCD for 21-22, and you were working in UCD archives. Is that right?
That's right.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. The award was for creative work with the archives at UCD, and my proposal was to work with the RT scripts collection, RT radio scripts collection, held in the archives. For reasons that of my own interest, to do with how language gets transmitted on page versus in spoken form or in broadcasting form. I was delighted to receive it, and I started work in September 2021.
And is the archive big? Was there a lot of material to go through?
Well, I didn't know how much material there was. There is a list online that tells you what is available, but doesn't say how much. And once I went to the actual physical space, I realized there was a lot of material, the equivalent of about 500 boxes of all kinds of ephemera, correspondence, and so on. That was really what interested me. It was the correspondence around the broadcasting and the talks that were broadcast on RT radio historically, rather than the scripts themselves. Yes, there was a lot of material. I worked with it in digital form. They were available to me also as physical artifacts, but it made more sense to work with them in a digital version, because everything is digitized. And it was also easier because this work was also done at time of partial lockdown as well. So the transfer of material was easier that way too.
So could you talk a bit about your creative process in relation to those materials? Like, how soon in the act of reading through that and looking at those images on the screen, do you get a sense of the scope of this book, It Reeks of Radio, that you're working on?
Yeah, it revealed itself over time through process. Like when I started working with the material, I didn't even know what the final form of what I was going to do would be. I didn't know whether that would be a book. I just had no idea. I had no preconceived notion. I wanted to discover what I would discover through looking through this material. So the material was kind of divided in sort of many different ways, by name, by era, by program, various different kind of ways. So all I could do is to look through it, and the vastness of the material kind of focused my mind in being very quick and very intuitive at selecting what seemed to be relevant to me, not relevant in any sort of preconceived way or in a way that pointed towards some kind of specific commentary or specific sort of or polemic or anything like that, but something that kind of seemed relevant poetically. It's the language, how language was used, how communication happened, turns of phrase, and so on. Slowly, certain threads started emerging, kind of thematic threads that I think are come across in the book. And also, I became very interested in the visual element, because a lot of this material, having been pre-internet, happened through the exchange of postcards, handwritten notes, kind of postal material, and so on. A lot of it had very interesting. There was an interesting sort of visual aspect in how these sort of extra bits of communication are happening, how kind of people might sort of put something in parentheses on the side, of kind of make notes on top of other notes and things like that. So that sort of reinforced the idea that what I was working with was communication, and communication within the institution that is RTE, but also taking into account its position and its kind of function in society, communication across to the public, communication to the artists that they worked with or other technical people that they worked with, and also across time, and also to different sections of society, which there was certain variations and all that stuff that sort of seemed the meat of what I was trying to do. That's where it was.
Mm-hmm. The book is really interesting as an object because it incorporates those material elements within it. So, we've got images of postcards or telegrams or documents presented in different ways in the book. And so I wondered, in terms of your creative process, at what point do you realize, oh, that image, that object is going to be actually part of the book in a material way?
Yeah, it came at different times. I mean, certain things seemed immediate. As soon as I saw certain fragments, I thought, well, this will have a place in it, because I kind of came across other material, mostly textual, earlier, that I could see a link. But I would make a really large document where I would kind of throw everything in, and then I would start moving things around and kind of trying to find the best way to present it, or some kind of format where I would connect different elements. Like the text itself is made of connections between different fragments of text, that everything is taken from the archives, all the text taken from the archives. So in the same way, I would start connecting kind of visual material to text or to other visual material, and then kind of trying to see what emerged out of that, what was suggested by doing this. And so it was the various sort of things going on at the same time, until I got to a stage kind of near the end of composition where I had a form was kind of suggested to me, and the series of threads or the branches of what I was trying to kind of put across, and then I tried to find a way of kind of bringing it all together into a book form.
Yeah, because it's really interesting, that sense of this interweaving that's going on right through the book. Once you had decided it was going to be in book form, were you thinking in terms of the page as the kind of visual unit, or how were you thinking of it in terms of its overall structure?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because we and it fits into my interest that kind of sparked the work with the radio archives. Is when we read a poem from a book and we read it ourselves as marks on a page, there's a difference between that and how it may be articulated, either by the author themselves or by somebody else. Every time it's different. So once the decision was made, or we made a decision that this was going to be a book, because we had the visual element, because of many other reasons, then the page and the dimensions of the page and the traditional, I guess, constraints of what a book of poetry consists of came into play. And then, yes, I was like, okay, how would, particularly when images came into the equation, is how would this fit into a page? Can we play with the idea of kind of going across the page? How because there were different formats of notes and letters in the archives and all that kind of stuff. So I wanted to put that across, that sort of, as you said, the materiality, but also the messiness of it all. So that was, despite the fact that we had the page to work with, how could we go beyond that in some sort of way, without, I guess, kind of ripping the page or making something that isn't a book.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well the way, I mean, obviously text is working in lots of different ways in the book, both obviously your own typeface, but the other forms of text, whether they're handwritten texts or other forms of reproduced text, is really interesting. But in your own treatment of text, you have various techniques. So you have strike-throughs, you have redactions, and then you have other elements, variable elements like use of italics and so on. So at what point, I suppose the first question might be, what is the difference between what you're doing with the strike-throughs and the redactions in terms of how you're playing with text there? Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah, but there's various elements that feed into this. The redactions first. one of the first things I wanted to do with this material is not to work with it in terms of what it was doing historically, what particular people were involved historically, what particular programs on RTE were being referenced, and so on. My interest was purely the language and how it was used. So therefore, there were moments when I wanted to use certain material, but there were kind of certain individuals being named, or certain identifiable events or something like that was being named, and I was kind of wondering what to do with this. And then at the same time, through my research, I was finding a lot of the communication across the years was around this kind of thing, around the idea of how can we redact certain things when we're broadcasting on the radio? How can we kind of leave certain things out? How can we edit this thing in, edit this thing out? So the idea of the editing, or of somebody else's hand sort of influencing the final outcome, embedded itself into the process. So the reductions were, I guess, practical in that sense, because certain names were redacted. That's fine. But they're also, going back to what I said before, they're also marks on a page, and then each reader views them and reads them differently. When you see a black mark on the page, what do you do with that? If you're going to read it out loud, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to say nothing? Are you going to say something incomprehensible? So each reader has their own relationship with the material in front of them. The same goes with the strike-throughs. The text is decipherable, so the text is not taken away, but there's a strike-through. So what does each reader think about that? Do they read it? Do they not? Do they read it in a different way? How do they think about the idea of editing or editing out? Because there's no editing out, it's there, we can see it. So the reader, I think, is forced to think about this behavior, this action. What does it do? What does it mean?
Because you do think, is that sentence different if I read that word apparently excised, or if I leave it out? It does make you think of that.
Exactly, what happens there. And there's a lot about editing. There's a lot about some institution's hand, or some higher power's hand, that kind of often invisible, that sort of has a great say in how radio programs are presented to the public. So that kind of came in to my thinking as well. The italics, again, this is a polyvocal piece. There are lots of voices represented. So the use of italics sort of suggests a different kind of voice, a little bit more to the side. So those are, that's how I played with that aspect. Again, is to give certain hints, certain suggestions to the reader, but each reader themselves will be able to kind of read it as they want, and as they naturally will.
One of the things that struck me was, we think back to that period, particularly if you're looking at that mid-century period, and I imagined that most of the language was from a man, it was written originally by men. But obviously because of the excise names and everything, we don't, it is sort of contextless in that sense. But did you think of that issue of the masculinity of the language, or the kind of perhaps the gender politics? Because obviously the representation of women, or women are addressed, or questionably addressed, if you like, in the book. So was that a big thing? Is that something you thought a lot about?
It was one of the main themes that I found. I was expecting to find an element of that, as we know with the history of kind of who is in positions of power, who speaks, but it was more pronounced than I thought. So therefore, it's in the book quite a bit, and I was particularly interested in those parts of the archives where women presenters or women writers had a series of communications with the producers at RT. What was the tone like? What was, and it was a different tone. It was kind of less pally. It was less kind of friendly in a way. It was something different about it, and you could see it. Even though I didn't know the people, I didn't do any research to find out who these people are. In some cases, I knew who they were, but not by any means all or most. So it was very interesting to me, and again, that's where the hub of the book is. That's where I kind of try to extract that and kind of bring it in some sort of way into the text of this book. So yeah, definitely.
The other thing that really struck me was the English-Irish thing, that's and the two apparently contradictory positions, one of which is people aren't interested in English things, that there's this drive towards having a very specific Irish identity to the material. And then on the other hand, this acknowledgement that, well, people are actually absorbing English popular culture, and that really stood out. So that was obviously something that you kind of discovered through going through that material.
Absolutely, yeah. I was very aware of it before. I think it still happens to an extent. I think there is that kind of, I think the word is used in the book, schizophrenia. I think that's still there. I'm very much aware of it because I came to Ireland 20 odd years ago from England, from London, and it was apparent to me. I expected to find, once I kind of got settled and everything, I expected to find that there was definitely a different kind of narrative or a different sort of broadcasting voice or broadcasting angle to various things, but then I kind of very quickly I realized a lot of things were very similar. A lot of things were imported wholesale from England, from Britain, and they kind of framed conversations, not exclusively, of course, but I thought it was kind of more pronounced than I expected it to be. So that's when I saw that in the archives. I think that sort of struck a kind of chord with what I already knew. So I wanted to explore it a little bit, and yeah, there was quite a bit in there, and the power balance or the facilities that were available through BBC that were not available to RT in some cases, where certain things had to be arranged so that certain kind of writers could do their recordings through BBC equipment because RT didn't have it, and things like that. That was very interesting to observe, for sure.
The other thing that's really struck me about the book is that it's very funny, and I wondered, I wondered how much of that, some of the phrasing that I suppose, when you're going back 50 or more years, there is an inherent amusement to some of the perhaps more formal phrasing. But obviously much of it is created by the juxtaposition, and sometimes it's quite darkly funny, but, it's created by the juxtaposition of what you're doing with language. So I was wondering, did you find the material amusing as you read it, or were you trying to create a sort of those tonal shifts as we read?
Yeah.
Were you conscious of that?
Funny. Humor is deadly serious, isn't it? It can be, and sometimes overt seriousness is not very serious. I was aware of this. I was trying to avoid the trap of saying, oh, look how funny things were so many years ago if we look at them from our perspective now. There was quite a bit of that where I could have taken certain material and kind of shown it that would kind of veer towards that direction. I wanted to avoid that. So I know there is a little bit of it in it, because obviously how language is used, how words are understood, how phrases are understood change over a period of time. That's language is a living, breathing thing. It changes. So that is part of the work, of the book. But, the idea of something being funny, consciously funny, yes, it's there a little bit, but it's more what sort of energy those juxtapositions emit. Sometimes, yes, they're humorous. Other times, through the humor, something else comes out.
An unease or something there.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to kind of a lot of other work that I've done previously with found text or with fragments of text that isn't necessarily historical. It's contemporary. It's kind of how how something can be revealed through these juxtapositions that maybe don't sit very well together, but once you put them together, there's this gap, there's this, some kind of chemistry happens, and it sort of, it emits something that, a little bit uneasy, sometimes a little bit dark, sometimes a little bit funny. What do all these things mean, and how do kind of different readers read them, because others might read them differently than you or I. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, humor is so subjective, isn't it? So, or offense is subjective, or so many other things are subjective. So it's kind of trying to find those points where those kind of energies are released, and that's what I was trying to do.
And just to turn back to your working practices a little bit, when you're working, are you adding material? When you're drawing that material from your resources, and as you talked about sort of compiling a file of materials and so on, are you always expanding the text, or do you work in the opposite way? Do you create a much larger text, which then you kind of whittle down or edit back?
It's a bit of ebb and flow. The 500 boxes worth of material, you have to redact. You have to select. So inevitably, the first thing you do is to contract, is to kind of make some certain decisions. But then once you get to the point of composition, especially I'm talking about this book specifically, the fact that there are all those different threads that are pulled throughout the book, the gender or the nationality or various other things, it means that I was adding material to different parts of, let's say, the text, but at the same time, there would be a point where I would realize, okay, that the balance isn't quite right, or, something says exactly the same as something else. So then I would kind of take something out, or maybe I would move it somewhere else, or maybe I would put a different part of the text of the book, or other times it would go away. So it was a combination of those two things, adding, subtracting, until, again, all quite intuitive. The balance is intuitive. There was no specific methods, like it has to be so many kind of lines here, or so many kind of number of pages dealing with this subject there. More intuitive, and even more so when it came to finalizing the text, finalizing the material. Is there a balance? Is there a sense of something moving through the book, some kind of energy? Does the reader finish and then go back and see, well, hold on, I read something here that refers to something further back. Are there those instances? Because I'm very interested in that. It's not a linear reading. No reading is linear, but in a book of poetry like this, I think it's really important to encourage the reader not to read linearly.
And that sense of it as an organic, almost like an organic object, which is changing form in a sense as you add parts and subtract parts.
That's right.
I think is really interesting.
That's part of the process. I think that I was working in this process, so some part of it hopefully made it into the final piece, because again, in kind of the way I work and I worked in the past, I do like to have my process embedded in the product, in what is presented to a reader. So there is an element of an understanding or an appreciation or kind of going on that sort of journey sort of way with me, or giving it a little bit of more depth, I think.
So maybe to finish, I mean, you've got a beautiful book, which in its own materiality, I think really, enhances the work you're doing in really interesting ways. And you also, of course, have a small exhibition here at UCD, which is another way of having people in different contexts, encounter the work. Do you feel that there are threads of this work that will perhaps persist for you creatively, or do you feel this was very much a self-enclosed project?
Yes, it is a beautiful book, and the design, I did some of the design. They designed the page, I designed how the text would look, but we had the designer David Donahoe who did a fantastic job in kind of putting the book together as a physical object. and also designed the exhibition at UCD. So I wanted to mention that. With respect to my work, it's not self-contained. It does pick up on a lot of the work I was doing before. I was working a lot with, like I said before, found fragments in obviously different contexts. And it points to something else going forward. I had worked with visual material embedded through the text before in a smaller setting, but it's become something that I'm looking to work with more. I already have started a kind of new project of my own where I think this process will persist and will develop in there. It is very much a part of my practice, a part of my practice as it develops. It came from something that I had done before, and it will persist to something else for sure. Yeah.
No, that's great. So thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much.